This newspaper headline from 1917 by El Paso Morning Times titled "Order to Bathe Starts Near Riot Among Juarez Women" reveals a rather obscure history about the U.S.-Mexican border. In 1917, American health officials in El Paso, Texas, actually mandated the forcible bathing of working-class Mexicans and their belongings in dangerous chemicals. The use of disinfection facilities as well as chemicals like Zyklon B would later be adopted by the Nazis. But that's outside the scope of this study. Here, we'll be focusing on the bath riots, led by Carmelita Torres, a 17-year-old maid from Juarez, who, on the morning of January 28, 1917, when asked by custom officials at the Santa Fe Bridge to get off the trolley, take a bath, and be disinfected with gasoline, refused. Instead, she rallied 30 other female passengers to get off with her, and by noon, their numbers were estimated to be several thousand. The woman blocked all traffic into El Paso and briefly shut down the border in a riot that lasted 2 days. Though Carmelita Torres and 7 other women would be arrested, their opposition to this humiliating process was a direct blow to white supremacy and xenophobic sentiments at the time. What's more, this news article doesn't only bring attention to the courage of these women, it highlights an often forgotten history about the US border, in which a health crisis, namely the typhus epidemic, was used as an attempt to assert control over Latina bodies. So, to understand the bath riots, we have to understand the context of the time in which they were built. Looking at a response to another typhus outbreak in Los Angeles County in 1916 will help us see the connections between public health policies and the development of long-lasting representations of Mexicans as disease carriers. Here, when a Mexican railroad worker came down with typhus at a camp near Palmdale, public health officials immediately took action, implementing education and sanitation campaigns exclusively targeting Mexicans. It was advised that every individual hailing from Mexico should be regarded as potentially pathogenic. Consequently, in 30 railroad camps in California, workers were inspected and deloused using cyanide gas to destroy lice, ticks, and other pests. The California State Board of Health would also create a list of regulations distributed to railroad camps. But the board's new regulations largely ignored the unsanitary living conditions of the camps, and instead focused on improving laborers' personal hygiene. As a result, frustrated with health officials' insistent focus on remedying Mexicans' unclean habits, with little done to improve living conditions within the camps, a group of Mexicans sent a formal letter of complaint to the Mexican consul in Los Angeles. By failing to treat typhus as a threat to the public at large, officials constructed the disease as uniquely Mexican, framing them as transmitters of deadly disease. Visual depictions during this time by the California State Board of Health monthly bulletin were also increasingly influential in constructing the illusion of Mexicans as unclean and ignorant of basic hygiene practices. On the cover of their October issue in 1916, a photograph of Mexican men, women, and children who lived in the railroad camps were displayed with the caption, "The type of people who are bringing typhus and other diseases into California from Mexico." In other words, race, not symptoms, became shorthand for disease carrier. While this is happening in Los Angeles, the typhus epidemic heavily influenced immigration inspection procedures at the U.S.-Mexican border. El Paso's Mayor Tom Lee was a key figure in advocating for the creation of these disinfection centers. In a telegram sent on June 17, 1916, Tom Lee called for the implementation of a quarantine camp on the southern border to protect against the dirty, lousy, destitute Mexicans who will undoubtedly bring typhus. Considering Lee's request as extreme, the public health service officials stationed in El Paso eventually suggested setting up delousing plants instead. By mid-1916, $6,000 were granted for the construction of a disinfection plant at the Santa Fe Bridge that would be ready by January 1917. It's worth mentioning that even before the fumigation plant was ready, Lee had already begun to tackle this epidemic close to home, starting at Chihuahuita, the Mexican quarter of a town where lice were found. Occupants were obligated to take vinegar and kerosene baths, shave their heads, and burn their clothing. Even though reports indicated that Chihuahuita was not the festering plague spot that it is pictured to be, under Lee's orders, demolition squads destroyed hundreds of Mexican adobe homes, leaving thousands homeless. A public health report published after the disinfection plant's opening outlined in detail the methods of the quarantine. It reveals the explicit class discrimination and racialization along the southern border. It stated that all persons coming to El Paso, Texas, from Mexico, considered as likely to be vermin-infested, are sent through this plant for disinfection. But how exactly did officials determine who was likely to have typhus? It is implied that officials targeted those who physically appeared to be of the working class, either by dress or ethnicity. Thus, those with indigenous and mestizo physical markers were forced to endure chemical baths, fumigation, and degrading full-body visual inspections, while Mexicans that were white or well-dressed and of higher social status were not only inspected privately, but were also allowed to skip the delousing baths. In a process that was to be repeated every 8 days, every second-class Juarez citizen was to strip completely, turn in their clothes and baggage, to be steam-dried and fumigated with hydrocyanic acid, and stand before a customs inspector who would check his or her hairy parts, the scalp, armpits, chest, pubic area, and anus for lice. Evidently, the El Paso Morning Times news article sheds light on the degrading health policies taking place at the U.S. border. Furthermore, not only do we learn about women's resistance to these inhumane practices, but we also gain a much larger understanding of how bath riots were a response to racialized public health policies that discriminated against Mexicans considered disease carriers.